By joining a loose alliance designed to chip away at Western superiority, did India set itself up for an inevitable fall? That alliance is known as BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and it's essentially an informal club. Think NATO without the official status, dedicated to expanding the political and economic interests of its members. For years, India's benefited from being a part of BRICS, but with the organization's recent expansion, India might be seeing its commitment of non-alignment get challenged, potentially leading to conflict with Western nations, or perhaps even worse, its fellow BRICS members. This isn't what India expected when it joined the alliance. And with the challenges occurring in BRICS as we speak, now might be the time to walk away from the group before India becomes so firmly entrenched within the alliance that it's forced to commit to decisions it otherwise would not make. To explain why, we need to start by answering a simple question: what is BRICS? You already know the basics. BRICS is a loose alliance of 5 countries, though that has changed in recent months, which was officially founded in 2009 to provide a platform for its members. That platform, primarily focused on Asia, is intended to challenge the political power wielded by the United States and other Western powers, essentially giving countries that previously had less of a voice on the global stage more negotiating power. Interestingly, even though the BRICS acronym became official in 2009, it had actually been used much earlier. In 2001, economist Jim O'Neill coined the term in an article for Goldman Sachs titled "Building Better Global Economic BRICS." In that article, he pointed to what would become the 4 founding members of BRICS as some of the fastest-growing economies in the world, even going so far as to claim they would likely dominate the global economy by 2050. A claim that doesn't appear unrealistic given the state of the world in 2023. Since the inception of BRICS, the heads of state of each of its member countries have met annually to discuss global political and economic policy, with the chairmanships rotating among those members on an annual basis. Collectively, the leaders oversee the fates of about 40% of the world's population, somewhere in the region of 3.2 billion people, so its influence cannot be understated. Ostensibly, the group is supposed to enhance economic cooperation between its members, particularly in the areas of trade and infrastructural development, all in the hopes of creating a foundation on which the BRICS members can stand when negotiating on a global scale. So far, so beneficial to India. The existence of BRICS, at least in its theoretical form, is supposed to deliver substantial economic benefits to India. The country's infrastructure should improve, and its economy should grow stronger as a result of the alliance. And in fairness to BRICS, that has generally been the case since 2009. The World Bank's GDP growth stats for India show, barring a massive blip during 2020 that can't be blamed on BRICS membership, India's economy has generally grown consistently since it joined the alliance. For instance, in 2021, India saw its GDP rise by 9.1%, with 2022 following that with a 7% increase. Again, so far, so good. BRICS appears to be achieving what India hoped it could achieve when it joined the group. But if that's the case, why are many on the world stage saying now is the time for India to leave the loose alliance? The simple answer is that there are factors at play that could lead to BRICS membership becoming less of a blessing and more of a curse in the coming years, and that starts with the recent expansion of the group. In August 2023, BRICS invited 6 new countries into its club. Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are the heaviest hitters, particularly Saudi Arabia, thanks to its huge cash reserves. And the other 3 new members, Argentina, Ethiopia, and Egypt, all stand to gain from being a part of the alliance that's supposed to bolster their economies and help transform them into respectable world powers. Marking the group's first expansion since 2010, when it welcomed South Africa into the fold, the new alliance has coined the moniker of BRICS Plus, and it seems to be on track to enhance its goal of switching the current geopolitical power balance in favor of countries that don't have much of a place at the Western-led table. But in this expansion, we start to see the formation of divergent interests in the group that could place India at odds with the rest of its members. Take China and Russia as examples. Both are countries that have long been at odds with Western powers. Some might even argue that Russia at least is actively anti-West, with China certainly not too far behind. India has never traditionally shared the anti-West approach. Yes, it wants to grow its economy and strengthen its position on the global political stage, but at the same time, India's always taken an approach of nurturing ties with everyone, essentially trying to stay as neutral as possible. That might soon become impossible if India chooses to keep operating within a group that's displaying increasingly anti-West sentiments. Now cast your mind back to the proposed new members of BRICS. Iran should stand out immediately. Much of the 2010s was marred by diplomatic conflict between the United States and Iran. The states issued 9 executive orders designed to neuter Iran in some way between 2010 and 2013 alone. with several of those orders imposing sanctions while condemning Iran for its human rights abuses. So Iran clearly has an axe to grind with the US, an axe that's actually been grinding since the seizure of the US Embassy in Tehran in 1979. America's relationship with Saudi Arabia is just a little more complicated. The countries share deep diplomatic ties based predominantly around oil, with the US being a somewhat overt ally to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for nearly 80 years. But there is no denying the Saudis have their own agenda, and it's possible that its inclusion into the new BRICS could lead to mounting instability in a relationship that's been rock solid for decades. What about Argentina? It went to war with the United Kingdom in the 1980s over the Falklands, and there still exists some resentment and tension about a Western country's claim on an island that Argentina believes should be theirs. The point is simple: BRICS's new members have either an anti-West stance or at least engage in policies that cause concern for the current dominating force of the geopolitical landscape. While that's the point, BRICS exists to upset the current global status quo. It's a point that's getting ever sharper, which is something that India might not feel comfortable with as BRICS expands its power base, and that's becoming an increasingly urgent problem. If we allow a moment for speculation, what might happen if a BRICS member, say Iran or China, enters into direct conflict with a Western power? Would India be expected to support its fellow BRICS members financially? Would it feel obligated to provide military aid in order to maintain its relationships within BRICS? These are questions we don't have the answers to, but they are questions that could make many in India feel uncomfortable. After all, the country enjoys a good relationship with many Western powers. Yet, the inclusion of these 6 new members, combined with China's growing political power and Russia's attempts to expand its territory in Europe, could place India in a difficult position. Perhaps we're seeing a soft power play at work here, in which BRICS continues to speak openly about building trade and creating a bigger seat at the global table for marginalized states, while its members use the alliance to further their own political agendas. If that's the case, due to its neutrality, India could be a mere pawn in BRICS's game to upend the Western world order. An anti-West stance could be forced upon it. Perhaps even more dangerously for India, it might find itself at odds with its fellow BRICS members, potentially seeking support outside the alliance to maintain its global position. For its part, India has subtly tried to get ahead of these potential issues. In a June 2023 meeting of BRICS members, the country's foreign minister, Subramaniam Jaishankar, made sure to keep his focus on economic power, remarking that the current balance leaves too many nations at the mercy of too few. That is essentially a restatement of BRICS's original goal, to revise the global power balance so that its members have more of a voice. But the simple fact that Jaishankar made that statement suggests that India is getting a touch uncomfortable with increasingly contrasting agendas of the club's members. That brings us to the most obvious example of these differing agendas: the war in Ukraine, where India appears to be trying to use BRICS meetings to reaffirm the organization's original agenda. Putin is using those very same summits to justify his actions in Ukraine. That was made clear during the August 2023 BRICS summit, where Putin appeared via video link to claim that the invasion was not an invasion at all, but a response to the supposedly increasingly hostile actions of Washington and Kyiv against Moscow. Our actions in Ukraine are dictated by only one thing: to end the war that was unleashed by the West and its satellites against the people who live in the Donbass, Putin said. But perhaps more indicative of his approach was his follow-up statement: "I want to note that it was the desire to maintain their hegemony in the world, the desire of some countries to maintain this hegemony, that led to the severe crisis in Ukraine." Here we see a twisting of the BRICS agenda. Putin mentions maintaining a hegemony, referencing the West's continued hold over the global geopolitical landscape, and in doing so, he tries to position his war not as an act of aggression by Moscow, but as an action taken in the spirit of BRICS, with the goal of disrupting the current global power balance. India wants to do that by following the original BRICS agenda, economic strengthening of the countries within the club. But Putin seems happy to twist that agenda to fit his own ends. It's also telling that Putin didn't show up in South Africa, the host country of the 2023 summit. Given South Africa's membership in the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, he could have been arrested for war crimes if he showed up in person. So Putin showed up via video to push his agenda. This has put India between a rock and a hard place. It's emblematic of the anti-West sentiment that's growing within BRICS, where some members of the group are no longer proposing themselves as an alternative, but as active combatants in a war against Western interests. So we start to see the uncomfortable position in which India finds itself. Is Russia expecting India to support its acts of aggression? Perhaps it does, which may be why India is one of the few US allies that hasn't joined the world in its public condemnation of the invasion. Instead, India's tried to remain neutral, a position that might put it at odds with both Russia and the US if it isn't careful. Abstaining from votes to condemn Russia in the UN Security Council, Human Rights Council, and General Assembly could all be seen as India's tacit acceptance of Putin's tactics. But the lack of direct support it offers could also lead to Russian aggression if Putin is successful in Ukraine and later decides to take stock of who his allies really are. But perhaps India is less focused on picking a side between Russia and the Western powers because it has problems of its own to handle, namely China. If membership to BRICS is supposed to signify strong economic ties between China and India, the recent skirmishes taking place along the India-China border suggests the mutual trust that exists between the two nations is fraying. It all comes down to the Line of Actual Control, or the LAC, a 2,100-mile border that separates China and northern India. The LAC is contested. Both China and India want to have control of it, and a skirmish that occurred in the summer of 2020 demonstrated that economic alliances don't result in military peace. Granted, the skirmish was relatively small, at least compared to what you might expect from such a battle. Depending on who you ask, around 40 to 50 people died as a result, with the deaths being split quite evenly between the two sides. Even so, neither side used any firearms, so most of the soldiers involved only sustained a few injuries. This border skirmish led to a round of 17 military talks between China and India that failed to find a satisfactory resolution. Neither country seems willing to back down. Since that skirmish, the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, has carried on building infrastructure while reinforcing its ground-based presence in the contested area. For its part, New Delhi directed 50,000 troops to the LAC in 2021 and has plans to build over 70 strategic roads near the border, as well as maintains an Air Force presence in the region. This has all happened despite both countries signing disengagement agreements since 2020. We're looking at a powder keg that seems like it's going to explode sooner rather than later. Imagine this scenario. Russia is successful in its invasion of Ukraine and reinforces itself as a military power in Europe. It then turns its attention to other countries, namely those that didn't offer it direct support despite supposedly being aligned with its goal of tackling Western hegemony. India falls into that category thanks to its neutral stance. Perhaps China could take advantage of that by calling on Moscow to help it in the LAC. After all, China has blamed both the West and NATO for provoking Russia into its attack on Ukraine, a position that Putin will certainly find pleasing, and it appears to be supporting Moscow even as it claims that it wants to serve as a peacekeeper. If Putin wins and goes on to take stock, he's going to see that one of his BRICS allies supported him where another didn't, and that could spell danger for India should China choose to escalate its military actions along the LAC. And it's not just the LAC that presents a problem to India where China is concerned. China is also increasing its military presence in both the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. For instance, a 2022 article published in The Guardian claimed that China has militarized at least 3 of the islands in the South China Sea, disputed territory by the way, by installing anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile systems. Radar jammers are also in place, and there's apparently a stock of fighter jets that call this trio of islands home. This is all according to Admiral John C. Aquilino, a U.S. Indo-Pacific commander, who points out that China's previously assured other countries that it wouldn't turn these artificial islands into military bases. The country's actions are a little more ambiguous in the Indian Ocean, but no less threatening. Over the past 30 years, China's been building more and stronger relationships with countries that have ports leading into the Indian Ocean. Some of these relationships appear altruistic. China offers support to the countries in question, whereas others seem to show China is trying to leverage debt trap diplomacy by funding infrastructural improvements in different countries that it can later use as a bargaining tool to set up shop should a war break out. There will be more on that tactic when we explore the Belt and Road Initiative. More worrying from an Indian perspective is China's ongoing efforts to create a blue water fleet that's capable of operating in the ocean. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's 2020 annual report, China had more than 100 frigates, destroyers, and corvettes that could be used to conduct missions in the Indian Ocean. That was 3 years ago. How many more of those ships exist in 2023? All of these actions point to China preparing to undertake a more aggressive approach to its already fractured relationship with India in the near future. And if that were to happen, could India's BRICS membership count against it? There's no guarantee that India would receive Western support in such a situation if it refuses to leave BRICS, despite the growing anti-West sentiment that exists in the group. On top of that, if it comes to war, India might not be able to rely on other BRICS members, especially those that are reliant on China for supporting their economic growth. That brings us to China's potentially insidious infrastructure program, the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The idea behind the BRI is on the surface as beneficial to the Asian economy as BRICS is purported to be. It's an initiative dubbed the New Silk Road by some that was launched by China's President Xi Jinping as a massive infrastructural project that links East Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. China essentially acts as a lender, providing most of the funds developing nations need to build new roads and similar infrastructure, enhancing regional development and providing China with more nations to export its goods to. And therein lies the problem. China provides most of the funds. Some analysts have classified the BRI as a potential Trojan horse project to aid China in both its regional development and military expansion throughout Asia. China is heavily invested in the project. Some estimates put their investment into the initiative at around $1 trillion so far, and they might spend as much as $8 trillion by the time they're finished. But remember, most of these, quote, investments have been given out as loans. So where does the Trojan horse aspect come into play? A 2021 study conducted by Aid Data, the Center for Global Development, the Kiel Institute, and the Peterson Institute found that China has already created over 100 debt financing contracts to pay for infrastructural developments. Within those contracts lurk some potentially catastrophic clauses. One gives China the right to demand repayment of its loans whenever it wants, creating a dangerous situation for the countries it's financing. After all, these countries don't have the money to build the infrastructure themselves, so they definitely don't have the cash reserves to repay an entire loan if China decides to renege on its agreements by asking for the money up front. While China doesn't appear to have exercised that clause with any countries yet, consider this. China has invested more than $65 billion into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor Project, or CPEC. And in October 2023, the two countries agreed on another deal in which China will fund the development of a new multi-billion-dollar railway in Pakistan, adding another $7 billion to the pot. Pakistan currently owes China somewhere in the region of $72 billion for BRI projects alone. This is a country with a GDP of $377 billion. As such, Pakistan has taken on an enormous amount of debt for which China could come calling at any moment. Given the historical tensions that already exist between Pakistan and India, it is not outside the realm of possibility that Pakistan might allow China to use the very infrastructure China is helping build to launch attacks on India in exchange for lowering some of its payments. It's the debt trap mentioned earlier in action. China's creating debt that it might be able to leverage in the future to gain advantageous positions. But it's a second clause that might be more damaging to India. China restricts its debtors from restructuring their loans with any of the 22 members of the Paris Club. This club is a collection of the most powerful economies on the planet, and it exists for a similar purpose to the BRI. And guess which country just happens to be a member? India. Think about this in the context of BRICS. The organization exists to help its member nations strengthen their economic footholds. Yet, China is inserting clauses into its BRI contracts that actively prevent India from helping smaller countries develop infrastructure, leaving said countries reliant on China alone to grow. Again, we're seeing diverging goals come into play. Where Russia seems intent on twisting the purpose of BRICS to serve its own purposes by using breaking the Western hegemony as a justification for war, China is essentially fulfilling the organization's aim through monetary intervention, but it's doing it in such a way that it excludes other BRICS members, India included, from playing a role in the infrastructural expansion throughout Asia. India is being cleverly leveraged away from agreements that could lead to it creating stronger diplomatic ties by a combination of China's flexing of its financial muscle and its clever funding agreements. So, we come back to the statement made in the video title, India should leave BRICS. Why? The addition of the new members to BRICS, Iran and Saudi Arabia in particular, weaken India's position in the organization and put it in a position where it might have to adopt an increasingly anti-Western approach if it maintains its membership. Russia's already pushing for this approach. We see that in Putin's efforts to use BRICS' purpose of breaking the Western geopolitical stranglehold as a justification for its invasion of Ukraine. It's also worth pointing out that India is a democracy. While not unique to BRICS, South Africa is a democracy too. It does mean that India's population has more of a say on its BRICS membership than the populations of other countries like Russia and China. And that population, coupled with India's leadership, might be concerned with the current expansion taking place in the organization. According to an article published by the Atlantic Council, 22 countries have applied for BRICS membership, with 6 of those having been successful. That's already painful enough for India, which risks losing its voice among the swell of new members. But if more countries join, India's position and its desire to use BRICS for economic expansion rather than militaristic shows of strength could be pushed to the wayside. Still, it's not like India doesn't have options if it does decide to leave BRICS. It could argue that one of the newest members, Iran, is well placed to replace India's I in BRICS. Granted, that's a somewhat flimsy argument, but India could use it as justification for leaving, perhaps arguing that it's achieved everything it would like to achieve within the alliance and it's now ready to let other nations benefit. Self-removal from BRICS would also allow India to focus on building stronger ties with nations in other emerging alliances. Take the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, as an example. India is already a member of this loose strategic alliance, which also includes Australia, Japan, and the United States. Observers already believe that India's membership into this group has helped it to counter China's ever-expanding economic and military ambitions. So perhaps leaving BRICS and deepening strategic ties through Quad would give India the backing it needs to ward off the many subtle threats China's been throwing in the country's direction. Another group which India could potentially exert more influence in is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Currently, that group includes several minor Asian countries: Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Laos, Brunei, and Indonesia. Like BRICS, ASEAN has the goal of strengthening the economies of its member nations. Imagine what the addition of India could achieve for that group. The current members get a heavy hitter that could act in a way similar to China in terms of funding infrastructure and encouraging economic growth. As for India, it benefits from building stronger regional ties with the kind of less powerful nations that China is currently currying favor with over the last few years. That extra backing could prove vital because China is also becoming a major problem for India and its involvement in BRICS. Beyond the active military skirmishes India faces along the LAC, China's cleverly leveraged its BRI program to potentially cut India out of being involved in the very economic expansion that it joined BRICS to support. China is building stronger regional ties with the BRI. It's also using the program to put itself in a position where it can place smaller regional powers into debt, reinforcing its own militaristic ambitions, while all India can do is sit back and watch. With several of the BRICS members highlighting their anti-Western agenda, India is in a position where its voice is growing quieter and its continued membership could spell trouble for its desire to stay neutral. But BRICS isn't all bad for India. There's no denying India's enjoyed major GDP growth since joining BRICS. Its economic ambitions have been realized, and there's a strong case to be made that the country will only get stronger in that department with each passing year. Reuters predicts a 6.3% growth for 2023 and 2024, keeping India on the generally upward trend it's enjoyed for over a decade. Additionally, BRICS expansion doesn't necessarily spell doom for India going forward. It actually raises the possibility of it forming deeper ties with its new countries added to the group, though those ties come with the issue of potentially alienating India from its Western allies. Still, if India stays as adept at walking the line between East and West as it has been since the formation of BRICS, there's a chance it could reap further economic benefits while continuing to enjoy support from the West should China become more aggressive. Leaving BRICS would also mean that India's voice disappears entirely, rather than simply being diminished or diluted. Does India want to risk losing any chance it has of steering BRICS in its desired direction by completely leaving the group, leaving China and Russia as the two major players controlling the conversation? All three would be compelling reasons to stay, were it not for the fact that India's influence on BRICS is already waning and it faces direct aggression from China. And given that Russia seems to be in China's corner, especially in terms of how to use BRICS to break the Western hold on geopolitics, India may find itself with two powerful enemies in the group should it decide to stay. All of that leads us to a simple conclusion: India has to leave BRICS. It must do so to shore up its ties to Western powers in case Chinese aggression on the LAC grows. It also must leave to prevent the organization from holding it back as the global superpower it has the potential to become. Do you agree with that conclusion, or do you think there are benefits to ongoing BRICS membership that justify India remaining a part of the group? Share your views in the comment section below. Now check out India versus China, who would win, or watch this video instead.